You're detaining the only man in this room who tried to save your company. Ethan Walker's voice was quiet enough to make everyone else in the boardroom stop talking. At 4:06 on a Friday afternoon, 31 floors above downtown Charlotte, a red number burned across the wall display behind CEO Clare Whitmore. $47,018,600. Unauthorized transfers. 11 shell vendors. 23 months. Claire stood at the head of the glass table, one hand resting beside a report she had read 3 times without understanding how the numbers could be real. Her CFO, Richard Caldwell, understood them perfectly. He pointed across the room at Ethan, the security guard standing beside the locked boardroom doors. He accessed restricted financial records, Richard said. Check his credentials. Check the logs. He's been inside areas he had no business entering. 2 members of corporate security turned toward Ethan. He didn't move. He was 39, dressed in the same Navy uniform Claire had seen 100 times without really seeing the man inside it. 3 weeks earlier, she had mocked him in front of 6 executives for questioning an invoice that wasn't his responsibility. You guard doors, Mr. Walker. Leave the numbers to people who understand them. She remembered the sentence now, because Ethan had not defended himself. He had simply looked at her for one long second and said, "Yes, ma'am." Richard placed a tablet on the table. His badge entered the restricted archive after midnight on Tuesday. The files he accessed connect directly to these transfers. Claire looked at the screen. Ethan Walker, 12:14 a.m. The evidence appeared clean. Almost too clean. "Mr. Walker," she said, "give me one reason I shouldn't have you removed from this building right now." Ethan slowly unclipped his security badge and placed it on the table. No anger. No panic. That unsettled Claire more than a denial would have. Because at 4 o'clock this afternoon, he said, someone authorized another $4.8 million transfer. Richard's expression did not change. Claire's did. "That transfer isn't on this report." "No," Ethan said. "It wouldn't be yet." Richard gave a short laugh. "And how would a security guard know that?" Ethan finally looked at him. "Because whoever built this scheme made one mistake." Silence settled over the room. Outside the windows, rush-hour traffic crawled along Tryon Street far below, tiny headlights moving between towers. Claire folded her arms. "What mistake?" Ethan turned back to her. They assumed nobody notices the man standing by the door. For the first time, Richard looked away. Ethan saw it. Claire didn't. Not yet. 11 weeks earlier, at 6:12 on a Tuesday morning, Ethan Walker stood in a small kitchen 12 miles outside Charlotte, cutting his 8-year-old daughter's pancakes into uneven stars while Sophie studied a page of number patterns beside her orange juice. His phone showed 6:12. His shift began at 7 o'clock. Sophie circled 4 numbers with a purple pencil. "Dad, these look different, but they're doing the same thing." Ethan glanced down. "What makes you think that?" She pointed at the page. "Because the pattern repeats." Ethan stopped cutting the pancake. For just a moment, something old returned to his eyes, something no one at Whitmore Systems knew was there. "Good catch, sophomore." She smiled. "You always say look twice." "I do. Why?" Ethan set the plate in front of her. "Because the first look shows you what someone wants you to see." At 6:46, he kissed the top of her head, picked up his Navy security jacket, and walked toward the door, having no idea that before the summer ended, that same rule would uncover $47 million hidden inside the company he was paid simply to guard. By 7:03 that Tuesday morning, Ethan Walker was standing behind the main security desk at Whitmore Systems, watching hundreds of employees pass through the polished lobby with coffee cups, laptop bags, and conversations already moving faster than the day itself. He had worked there for 3 months, long enough to recognize almost everyone by face, floor, and routine. Most people knew him only as Ethan from security. Some nodded. A few said good morning. Senior executives usually walked past without looking at him at all. Ethan preferred it that way. For years earlier, before Hannah died, his mornings had begun with financial records, procurement trails, and conference calls with attorneys. He had spent 11 years as a corporate fraud investigator, learning that dishonest people rarely invented perfect lies. They borrowed pieces of the truth and arranged them carefully. After Hannah was gone, None of that mattered as much as being home when Sophie needed him. He left the investigations, sold the downtown condo, and built a smaller life around school mornings, packed lunches, homework, and a job that ended when his shift ended. At 7:41, Clare Whitmore crossed the lobby, surrounded by 3 executives. She wore a charcoal suit and carried no coffee, only a leather portfolio. Ethan had seen her almost every weekday since he started. She was 36, controlled, efficient, and usually moving toward the elevators before anyone could decide whether to speak to her. That morning, she paused when an employee held the elevator for her, thanked him by name, then disappeared upstairs. Ethan noticed that people who were truly arrogant rarely bothered learning names. At 8:10, Richard Caldwell arrived. The 48-year-old chief financial officer had worked for Whitmore Systems longer than Clare had been its chief executive officer. Unlike Clare, Richard greeted everyone: receptionists, assistants, security guards. He remembered birthdays and asked about families. When he reached Ethan, he smiled. "Morning, Walker. How is your daughter?" "Doing well, sir. 3rd grade, right?" Ethan looked at him. "Yes, sir." Richard smiled again and entered the executive elevator. Ethan watched the doors close. There was nothing suspicious about remembering a security guard's daughter. Still, Ethan remembered it. Upstairs, Clare entered a board meeting carrying numbers she trusted because Richard Caldwell had given them to her. Her father had stepped away from daily leadership 8 months earlier after a serious health scare, and several board members had quietly questioned whether his daughter was ready to control a company with nearly 2,000 employees. Richard had defended her when others had not. He had known Clare since she was 22. He had attended family Christmas dinners. When her father became ill, Richard had been the person who stayed at headquarters until midnight, helping her stabilize the company. Clare trusted him because he had earned that trust 1 year at a time. At 6:38 that evening, Ethan was completing his final access review when something on the monitor caught his attention. Richard Caldwell had entered the executive garage at 6:11. Ethan knew because he had watched Richard drive away in a silver Mercedes 7 minutes later. But the building system showed something impossible. At 6:34, Richard Caldwell's credentials had opened a records room on the 31st floor. Ethan stared at the timestamp, then checked the garage camera again. Richard's Mercedes was already 3 miles away when his badge opened that door. Ethan did not report it. Not yet. He wrote the time on a small piece of paper, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket. The first look could be an error. Ethan Walker had learned a long time ago that the second look was where people started getting nervous. The next morning, Ethan arrived at 6:52 and checked the previous evening's access history before taking his position at the lobby desk. Richard Caldwell's impossible entry was still there. At 6:34 in the evening, his credentials had opened records room 31B, 23 minutes after he entered the executive garage and 16 minutes after Ethan watched his Mercedes leave the property. Ethan checked the security system for synchronization errors. None appeared. He checked whether Richard had been issued a second badge. He had not. Then Ethan did something his old profession had taught him to do when one fact refused to fit the others. He left it alone. 1 strange timestamp was an error. 2 were a pattern. 3 were a decision. On the 31st floor, Clare Whitmore was already in her office reviewing quarterly projections when Richard entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You are here early again," he said. Clare accepted one. "The board wants 12% growth and 6% lower operating costs." Apparently sleep was not included in the forecast. Richard smiled. "Your father used to say pressure was the admission price for leadership." Clare looked toward the framed photograph on her bookshelf. Her father stood beside her at her college graduation, 22-year-old Clare smiling as if the future had never frightened her. Richard was visible behind them. He had been there for nearly every important chapter since. "He also had you," Clare said. Richard's smile softened. "And now you do." Downstairs, Ethan heard none of that. He only saw Richard leave the elevator at 10:17, greet 2 assistants by name, and stop to help an older employee pick up papers that had slipped from a folder. Nothing about him suggested deception. That bothered Ethan more than obvious nervousness would have. At 3:20 that afternoon, Sophie called the security desk from her school office because her after-school science club had been canceled. Ethan arranged for their neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, to pick her up. When he ended the call, Claire was standing 10 feet away waiting for the executive elevator. "Your daughter?" she asked. Ethan looked surprised that she had noticed. "Yes, ma'am. Everything all right? It will be." The elevator opened. Claire stepped inside, then held the door. "You can take 5 minutes if you need to make arrangements." "Already handled." She gave a small nod and went upstairs. It was the first conversation they had ever had. At 6:15, Ethan's shift was nearly over when Richard entered the executive garage. At 6:22, his Mercedes passed the exit camera. Ethan watched the taillights disappear towards South Tryon Street. He waited. At 6:47, the access monitor flashed. Richard Caldwell. Records room 31B. Ethan felt the old part of his mind wake fully this time. Same floor. Same room. Almost the same interval. He printed nothing and opened no restricted files. He simply wrote both timestamps beneath the first pair already in his notebook. Then another notification appeared. At 6:49, records room 31B opened again, but this time the credential belonged to someone who was still inside the building. Ethan looked toward the private elevators. 31 floors above him, Clare Whitmore was conducting a video conference from her office. Yet the security system claimed her badge had just opened the same records room as Richard's. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds. One impossible entry could be a malfunction. Two could be coincidence. But somebody had just placed the chief executive officer in a room she had never entered, and for the first time Ethan understood that whatever he was looking at was not merely hiding from Clare. It was beginning to hide behind her. For the next 6 days, Ethan changed nothing about his routine. He arrived before 7, checked the lobby cameras, reviewed visitor badges, walked the loading entrance, and left in time to have dinner with Sophie. He did not open restricted records. He did not search Richard Caldwell's office. He simply watched. By Monday evening, the pattern had repeated 3 more times. Richard would leave the property, and 20 to 30 minutes later his credentials would appear on the 31st floor. Twice, Claire's badge appeared within minutes of his. On Tuesday morning, the first physical clue arrived without Ethan looking for it. A junior accounting assistant named Melissa Grant hurried through the lobby, carrying 2 overfilled folders. One slipped from her arm near the security desk, scattering invoices across the marble floor. Ethan stepped around the desk and helped her gather them. "Thank you," Melissa said. "Quarterly vendor review. I picked the wrong morning to skip coffee." Ethan handed her 3 pages, then stopped at a 4th. North Star Facility. Solutions. Emergency Access Control Maintenance. $312. The amount meant nothing. The company name did. North Star appeared repeatedly in temporary contractor entries, yet Ethan had never issued a North Star visitor badge. "Melissa," he said, "does this company send technicians here often?" She glanced at the invoice. "I guess so. Facilities approve them." Ethan handed it back. "Thanks." That afternoon, he checked only the visitor records he was authorized to review. North Star appeared 17 times in 9 weeks. Every entry showed arrival and departure times. No identification numbers. No photographs. No vehicle records. Whoever created those entries had made them look ordinary enough that no one would ask why they existed. At 4:35, Claire crossed the lobby with Richard and 6 executives after a strategy meeting. Ethan was standing beside the desk with the visitor log open. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Claire stopped. "Yes. I think there may be an issue with one of the contractor records." Richard looked at the screen. "Security handles contractor access every day. That is why I noticed it, sir." Claire checked her watch. "What issue?" "North Star Facility Solutions has 17 visits logged. I have never seen one of their technicians enter this building." One executive glanced at another. Richard smiled, as though Ethan had misunderstood something harmless. "Automated maintenance vendors sometimes use service entrances. Those entrances are monitored too." Claire's expression tightened. She had a board call in 10 minutes and no patience for a security guard questioning accounting procedures in front of senior leadership. "Mr. Walker, are you suggesting my finance department invented a contractor?" I am saying the records do not match what happened at the doors. Richard gave a quiet laugh. Claire looked at Ethan's uniform, then at the executives waiting behind her. You are security, Mr. Walker. Guard the doors. Leave the numbers to people who understand them. No one laughed, but the silence was worse. Ethan closed the visitor log. Yes, ma'am. Claire walked toward the elevators. Richard followed, but before the doors closed, he looked back at Ethan. The smile was gone. At 5:18, Ethan checked North Star again. 17 visitor entries had become 16. He refreshed the screen. 15. Another disappeared while he watched. Ethan did not move for several seconds. Someone upstairs had heard his warning, and instead of checking whether he was right, they were erasing the question. He took out his notebook and wrote one number beneath the access times, $312. It was the smallest number on the page, but Ethan knew from experience that large betrayals rarely announce themselves with large clues. Sometimes $47 million began with an invoice small enough that everyone important had already decided not to read it. The next morning, Ethan discovered that someone had changed his schedule. Beginning Monday, he will be transferred from the main lobby to the south parking entrance, a post with almost no access to executive traffic. The notice came from security operations, but the request had originated on the 31st floor. Ethan read it once, signed the acknowledgement, and went back to work. At 10:14, another message arrived. Formal warning. Unauthorized review of vendor records. He had reviewed only visitor logs, something his job required, but arguing would tell whoever was watching him exactly what he knew. So Ethan did what he had learned years earlier. He became quieter. By lunch, the lobby camera covering the service entrance had stopped recording. The maintenance ticket called it a routine equipment failure. Ethan checked the camera himself. Power was fine. Network connection was fine. Someone had disabled the recording function through an administrator account. At 3:30, Claire passed the desk alone. For half a second, she slowed. Ethan wondered whether she would mention what she had said in front of the executives. She did not. Afternoon, Mr. Walker. Miss Whitmore. She walked on, but the exchange stayed with her longer than she expected. He had not complained. He had not tried to embarrass her. It should have made the incident easier to forget. Instead, it made it harder. That evening, Ethan picked Sophie up from Mrs. Donnelly's house and drove home through light rain. After dinner, Sophie worked on a school assignment at the kitchen table while Ethan sat across from her with his notebook. He had copied no confidential records, only names, dates, and patterns he had personally observed. North Star Facility Solutions, Bellhaven Consulting, Crestline Technical Group, Meridian Access Partners. Sophie looked up from her colored pencils. Are those for work? Just something I'm trying to understand. She leaned closer. They have the same birthday. Ethan looked at her. What? Sophie pointed to 4 dates he had written beside the company names. These. You said those are when the company started, right? Ethan had mentioned it without thinking. Yes. Then they have the same birthday. Well, almost. He studied the dates. North Star had been registered on March 18th. Bellhaven on March 18th the following year. Crestline on September 7th. Meridian on September 7th. Sophie returned to her drawing. That is weird. Ethan said nothing. He opened his laptop and searched public state business records, information available to anyone. 40 minutes later, for vendors had become 7. By 10:16, 7 had become 11. Different names, different registered agents, different mailing addresses. But the formation dates repeated in pairs, and several addresses belonged to mailbox centers within a 5-mile radius. One date caught Ethan's attention. March 18th, 7 years earlier. He searched the company website archives. Richard Caldwell had been appointed chief financial officer on March 18th of that same year. Ethan leaned back. Coincidence was still possible. Then he totaled the publicly disclosed payments associated with the 11 vendors across available filings and contract notices. The number on his calculator stopped him cold. $47,018,600. From a hallway, Sophie called, Dad, I cannot sleep. Ethan closed the laptop immediately. Coming sophomore, he tucked her in a bed, found the stuffed rabbit that had fallen behind the nightstand. and waited until her eyes closed. Only then did he return to the kitchen. The number was still there. $47,018,600. Ethan stared at it, then noticed something he had missed. Every large payment required executive authorization. He traced the approvals through public board disclosures and the limited records he had legitimately seen at work. The same name appeared again and again. Not Richard Caldwell. Clare Whitmore. Ethan looked at the dark window above the sink. Someone had moved $47 million through 11 companies, and on paper, the person responsible was the woman who had mocked him for noticing 312. At 8:06 the next morning, Ethan asked Clare for 10 minutes. Her assistant offered him 4. Clare stood behind her desk when he entered, surrounded by glass walls and a skyline washed pale by morning rain. Richard Caldwell was not there. Ethan considered that fortunate. "This is about North Star again," Clare said. "It started with North Star." He placed one sheet of paper on her desk. No confidential files, no copied company records, only a handwritten list of 11 vendor names and dates gathered from public sources. Clare looked down. "What am I looking at?" 11 companies with repeating formation dates, overlapping address patterns, and payment histories that do not make sense. Her eyes stopped on the total. $47 million? $47,018,600. Clare looked up sharply. "You are a security guard." "Yes, ma'am. Security guards do not reconstruct vendor networks at their kitchen tables." Ethan was silent for a moment. "I used to investigate corporate fraud." The room changed. Clare studied him more carefully than she ever had. "For whom?" "Private firms. Insurance carriers. Outside counsel. 11 years. "Why is none of that in your personnel file?" "Because I did not apply to be an investigator." "Why stop?" Ethan's expression tightened, not with anger, but with a boundary. "My wife died 4 years ago. My daughter needed a father who came home when he said he would." Claire's eyes dropped briefly to the paper. For the first time, the uniform in front of her seemed less like an explanation and more like a choice. "Why bring this to me?" she asked. "Because the approvals point to you." Clare went still. Ethan continued before she could respond. "I do not believe you approve them. You do not know me." "No, but I know the access logs. Your credentials, open records room, 31B, while you were in your office on a video conference. Richard Caldwell's credentials opened the same room after he had already driven away." Claire's face hardened. "You track my chief financial officer? A monitored access activity. That is my job." The office door opened before Clare could answer. Richard entered carrying a tablet. "Clare, we have a problem." His eyes moved to Ethan, then to the paper. "Actually, I see you already found it." He placed the tablet beside Ethan's list. Security access records filled the screen. Ethan Walker. Restricted archive. 3 separate dates. After midnight. Clare stared at them. "That is impossible." Richard spoke gently. "We reviewed the logs after his accusations yesterday. His badge accessed restricted financial areas." Ethan looked at the timestamps. They were clean, precise, and false. Richard continued. "Information technology also found searches tied to vendor payment files." Clare turned toward Ethan. Whatever curiosity had entered her expression disappeared. "Did you access those files?" "No. Your credentials say you did." "Your credentials say you were in a records room while you were sitting in this office." Richard sighed. "That is convenient." Clare looked between them, but history weighed more than suspicion. Richard had stood beside her family for 14 years. Ethan had worked downstairs for 3 months. At 8:19, she made her decision. "Mr. Walker, you are suspended pending investigation. Turn your badge." Ethan removed it and placed it beside the paper. He did not argue. He did not remind her that she had mocked him. He only looked at Clare and said, "When you finally ask who benefits from making me look guilty, start with the man standing closest to you." Richard's expression barely changed. Ethan walked to the door. Clare watched him reach it, then noticed something on the vendor list. Beside one company, Ethan had written March 18th. She knew that date. She had sent Richard a bottle of 20-year bourbon every March 18th for 7 years. It was the anniversary of the day her father promoted him to chief financial officer. Clare did not call Ethan back. Not yet. For the next 3 hours, she did something Richard had spent years making unnecessary. She checked the numbers herself. She started with March 18th. North Star Facility Solutions had been formed on that date 7 years earlier. A second vendor appeared exactly 1 year later. 2 others shared September 7th, the date Richard had received authority over procurement approvals. Claire searched board packets, archived contracts, and payment summaries she was authorized to access as Chief Executive Officer. She found invoices for consulting, security upgrades, data compliance, and facility maintenance. Each expense was ordinary enough to disappear inside a company the size of Whitmore Systems. Together, they were not ordinary at all. At 11:26, Claire called Melissa Grant from accounting into her office. "Do not tell anyone I asked you this. Who verifies executive authorization on vendor payments?" Melissa hesitated. "The finance office does." "Who specifically?" "Final verification goes through Mr. Caldwell's team." Claire felt something inside her shift. "And my electronic approvals?" "They come through the executive authorization system." "Can they be entered manually?" Melissa became careful. "Only with administrative credentials." "Who has those?" Melissa named 3 people. Claire was one. The director of information technology was another. Richard was the third. After Melissa left, Claire opened the access records Ethan had mentioned. At 6:49 the previous Wednesday, her badge had opened records room 31B. Claire pulled up her calendar. At 6:49, she had been speaking on a video conference with 12 regional managers. There was a recording. Her face was visible on screen, while her badge was supposedly opening a door 40 feet down the hallway. Ethan had told the truth. At 1:08, Richard entered without knocking. "The board wants an emergency review of Walker's access." "Claire, close the file. Give me until 4. Richard studied her. "Why?" "Because I want every record verified before we accuse an employee of misconduct." For the first time in years, Richard did not immediately agree. "Claire, men like Walker survive by making themselves look useful." She looked at him. "Men like Walker?" Richard smiled, but too late. "You know what I mean? I'm beginning to wonder if I do." He left at 1:13. At 1:16, Claire called Ethan. He answered on the 4th ring. Children's voices echoed faintly behind him. He was waiting outside Sophie's school. "Miss Whitmore, you were right about my badge." Silence. "And Richard's?" he asked. "I'm checking." "Then check one more thing. Meridian Access Partners." Claire opened a vendor file. "What am I looking for?" "A scheduled payment." She found it. For $1,800,000. Release time for a clock that afternoon. "Ethan, how did you know?" "The smaller payments follow a cycle. The large ones close it." Claire stared at the authorization field. Her own name was already attached. "Can you come back?" "You suspended me." "I know. My daughter gets out in 9 minutes." Claire closed her eyes. She finally understood the difference between the man she had assumed he was and the man speaking to her now. "Pick up Sophie," she said. "Come afterward, if you are willing." At 3:52, Ethan entered the boardroom wearing no security badge. Richard was already there with 6 directors. At 3:59, nothing happened. Richard leaned back. "This is what we interrupted the board for." The clock changed to 4 o'clock. Claire refreshed the payment screen. For $1,800,000 moved into processing. The room went silent. She opened the authorization details. The approval carried her name. The administrative credential beneath it did not. Richard Caldwell. Richard stared at the screen. Ethan stared at Richard. Claire finally understood the betrayal was larger than stolen money. Someone had spent years building a financial trail designed to end with her name. For 3 seconds, nobody in the boardroom spoke. Richard Caldwell was the first to recover. "That proves nothing," he said. "Administrative credentials are shared during scheduled finance operations." Claire kept her eyes on the screen. "Not mine." Richard turned toward the directors. "This is exactly why we need an independent review. Walker has already demonstrated that he understands our systems well enough to manipulate records." Ethan stood near the door, hands empty, expression calm. "Then order the review." Richard looked at him. "Excuse me. Bring in an outside forensic accounting firm. Preserve every access log, every authorization record, every vendor file, every email, and every system backup. Do not let anyone in this room choose what gets reviewed. One director slowly nodded. Richard did not. Claire noticed. Do it, she said. Richard stepped closer to the table. Claire, think carefully. Freezing finance operations based on the theory of a suspended security guard could damage the company. $4,800,000 just entered processing under my name using your administrative credential, which can be explained. Then the auditors will explain it. Claire called the bank and ordered the transfer frozen before settlement. She contacted outside counsel, then requested an independent forensic team approved directly by the board. By 6:20 that evening, copies of the relevant systems had been preserved. By midnight, the first findings arrived. North Star, Bellhaven, Crestline, Meridian, and 7 other vendors were connected through layers of registered agents and mailing services. Several eventually led to entities controlled by people with personal or business ties to Richard. Worse, electronic approval records had been structured to make Claire appear responsible for payments she had never personally authorized. Richard was placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. Claire remained at the office until 2:14 in the morning. Ethan had gone home hours earlier. He had not asked for his job back. He had not asked for money. He had not even asked for an apology. That bothered her because she owed him all 3 things, and only one could be repaired with a signature. 2 days later, Claire drove 12 miles outside Charlotte and parked near Sophie's elementary school at 3:05 in the afternoon. No driver, no assistant, no contract waiting in the car. Ethan stood near the pickup area in jeans and a gray jacket. Sophie came through the doors carrying a cardboard model of the solar system, one paper planet hanging lower than the others. She saw Claire first. "Dad, the lady from your work is here." Ethan turned. His expression did not change. "Miss Whitmore." Claire walked toward him. "I did not come to hire you." Ethan waited. "I came to tell you that you were right, and I was cruel when you tried to help me." Sophie looked between them, quietly curious. Claire continued, "I judge your value by your uniform. Then when you brought me the truth, I trusted the person with a higher title. I cannot undo that." Ethan glanced towards Sophie before answering. "No, you cannot." Claire accepted it. The investigation found enough evidence to confirm the vendor network. Outside counsel is handling the rest. But there are nearly 2,000 employees whose retirement accounts, jobs, and families depend on this company surviving what comes next. I need someone who sees what everyone else overlooks. You have auditors. I do. Claire paused. They are protecting the company. You were protecting people before anyone asked you to. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "If I come back, I am not doing it for you." "I know." And at 3:15, I leave to pick up Sophie. Claire looked at the little girl holding the crooked solar system. "Then whatever happens at 3:16 can wait." Sophie smiled. Ethan almost did. On Monday morning, Claire called an emergency meeting with the same executives who had watched her dismiss him. Ethan stood beside the table. No uniform this time. Claire faced the room. "Before we discuss the investigation, there is something this company needs to hear from me. The man with the lowest title in this building protected Whitmore Systems when its highest-ranking officers failed to. I did not listen. That failure belongs to me." Ethan said nothing. He did not need to. For the first time since he entered Whitmore Systems, everyone in the room was looking at him, and Claire was the one making sure they understood why. 6 months later, the main lobby of Whitmore Systems looked exactly as it had when Ethan Walker first stood behind the security desk, but almost everything behind the glass walls had changed. The independent investigation confirmed that Richard Caldwell had used 11 shell vendors, manipulated administrative credentials, and routed $47,018,600 through false contracts while building a record designed to place responsibility on Clare. Outside counsel recovered a substantial portion of the money. Insurance covered part of the remaining loss, and the company turned the evidence over to the proper authorities. Claire did not hide behind a public relations statement. She appeared before employees herself and explained that the failure had not begun with a dishonest executive. It had begun with a culture where titles were trusted more than questions. She replaced the old approval system, created an independent ethics office, and gave employees a protected way to report concerns without permission from their supervisors. Ethan became director of corporate integrity, but his acceptance letter contained one condition written in his own hand. His workday ended in time to pick up Sophie. Claire signed beneath it without changing a word. Trust returned more slowly than a job title. Ethan made sure of that. Claire never asked him to forget what she had done, and she never tried to purchase forgiveness with bonuses or favors. Instead, she changed in small ways that were harder to fake. She started eating lunch with employees outside the executive floor. She learned the names of the evening security team. When someone questioned a report in a meeting, she listened before deciding whether the question was inconvenient. And every few weeks, she found herself at Ethan's kitchen table. At first, there was always a reason. Sophie needed help preparing for the science fair. Ethan wanted Claire to review a new ethics policy. Claire brought over documents that could have been discussed Monday morning. Eventually, none of them pretended every visit needed an explanation. Sophie developed her own relationship with Claire, built from ordinary things. They argued cheerfully over whether Pluto deserved to be a planet. Claire attended Sophie's science fair and stood in the back instead of making the day about herself. When Sophie won second place, Claire celebrated, as if the company had closed its largest contract. Ethan noticed all of it. He also noticed Claire never tried to occupy the place Hannah had left behind. That mattered more than Claire knew. One Saturday evening, nearly 9 months after the first North Star invoice appeared, Sophie set 3 plates on the kitchen table. Ethan looked at the third one. "Are we expecting somebody?" Sophie gave him the expression 8-year-olds reserve for adults, asking unnecessary questions. The doorbell rang. Claire stood outside holding a bakery box. "I was told there would be dinner." Ethan looked over his shoulder at Sophie. "You invited her? You both work too much." Claire tried not to smile. "Your daughter runs a very efficient operation." Ethan stepped aside. Apparently, nothing dramatic happened that evening. No expensive restaurant. No grand declaration. Claire burned one side of the garlic bread. Sophie told a story about school that lasted 12 minutes longer than necessary. Ethan laughed more than he had intended to. Later, when Sophie was upstairs getting ready for bed, Claire stood beside the kitchen window. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked. "Sometimes. You were standing at the door, and I barely saw you." Ethan looked at her. "You see me now?" Claire met his eyes. "Yes, Ido." On Monday morning, Ethan entered Whitmore Systems holding Sophie's forgotten science folder because he planned to drop at school during lunch. The new security guard opened the glass doors for him. Ethan thanked him by name. Across the lobby, Claire was waiting beside the elevators with 2 coffees. She handed him one. They walked forward together. Months earlier, Ethan had been paid to stand outside the doors where powerful people made decisions. Now those doors opened for him. But the real reversal was not the office upstairs, the recovered millions, or the title printed beneath his name. It was the simple knowledge that at 3:15 that afternoon, he would still be Sophie's father first. And when the workday ended, there were now 2 people waiting to build something with him that neither money nor power could create. A family chosen slowly, honestly, and one ordinary day at a time.